Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us, everyone. My name's Alexandra Bell, and I'm the Senior Policy Director at the Center for Arms Control and Nonproliferation. I'm honored to be a part of the ASIL annual meeting and to be moderating this panel, Where Next? The International Arms Control Framework. While there are many crises around the world, the threat of nuclear weapons is everywhere and ever present. It's really issue zero. If we're not getting this particular problem right, nothing really else matters. So to discuss how we move ahead on the various challenges we're facing and nuclear risk reduction, we're joined by three eminent leaders on the topic. Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu is the United Nations Undersecretary General and High Representative for Disarmament Affairs and has been in this post since May of 2017. She's also held several other senior positions during her 12-year tenure at the United Nations. Ms. Lynn Ruston is the Vice President of Global Nuclear Policy at the Nuclear Threat Initiative and has held senior positions in the White House, the Department of State, and Congress. Dr. Zia Mian is a physicist and co-director of Princeton University's Program on Science and Global Security, part of the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. He also directs the program's project on peace and security in South Asia. We'll begin with a series of questions on key nuclear policy issues that the United States and the international community are facing at this moment, and then we'll have time for questions from the audience. To start, we will hear from High Representative Nakamitsu. Good afternoon, High Representative.
Good afternoon.
As you are no doubt aware, the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty Review Conference, a review process that happens once every 5 years under the terms of the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, has been postponed this year due to COVID. But before it was, the general feeling was that we were heading toward a rather contentious review conference. So given this respite and the chance to have a little bit more time before the review conference actually happens again, what do you think parties should be doing to ensure a more successful outcome?
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity, and thank you for the very important question. Indeed, the review conference, which will be a 10th review conference, is postponed. We do have a tentative date, however, starting on 4th of January next year, 2021. We really hope that the review conference will be able to go ahead. And as I said, I think many people were indeed concerned before the COVID, of course, that the review conference will be a difficult one. But we were very much hoping, and indeed we have been working very, very hard to, if you will, prevent a missed opportunity that is in front of us, that is the review conference. Now, I think states parties really need to, take advantage of the postponement. Let's not think that this is a disadvantage, but indeed, we do have an opportunity to work on, number one, try to, find a common grounds and work on the, conversions of positions and indeed maintaining momentum. Now, I think if I could actually start with the COVID-19 crisis, one of the lessons I think that we are all learning, hopefully, is that global crises indeed require collective responses. And that goes also to the nuclear crisis as well. So let us think that the review conference, whenever it would take place, hopefully January next year, will be an opportunity for us to collectively exercise that responsibility. Now, let me say three broad things how states parties and everyone, including ourselves at the UN Secretariat, should be doing in view of the preparation period that is in front of us. Number one is NPT parties really need to approach the conference in a spirit of flexibility and also willingness to engage in genuine dialogue, not just dialogue for dialogue's sake, but really a genuine one. And whilst they are trying to do that, I really urge everyone to demonstrate restraint so that, if you will, a climate climate that is conducive to a real negotiations will be created. And I think the states parties really benefited before the COVID, the three preparatory committees, the more opportunities of those parties actually coming together and then finding a common ground where they could agree will be very, very important. The more opportunities they have, the more chances that they will have in terms of arriving at a common ground. And the second point is exactly that. So the pause, if you will, the postponement, let's take it as an opportunity, and let's keep a momentum that we had for the 50th anniversary of the entry into force of the treaty. And with that view, we are actually taking quite a lot of initiatives, so very different ones. There have been, as you might have noticed, there have been numerous initiatives by civil society, groups of states that have been taking place through these online platforms. And I think all these webinars and discussions are really helping us to maintain the momentum. We are, the UN ODA is also working in support of the president designate. He has been also very actively consulting states parties, and that is also helping. And we, the UN, have been holding also a series of track 2 type of events as well. I think one of the most important things is the P5, or in this context, N5 processes, the nuclear weapon states within the context of the NPT still getting together and having consultations. Let us hope that this will, in fact, prepare reasonable common grounds amongst themselves, because the unity amongst the nuclear weapon states and the willingness to compromise have been essential for the previous success in the NPT context. We had some news from Vienna. The Russian Federation and the United States did have difficult but positive. I think those are the words that we hear from both country high-level representatives, and I think it is very important. And I will, of course, not to fail to encourage two countries to indeed extend the New START treaty, which is one of the critical issues in terms of demonstrating their commitments to the Article 6 provisions as well. Now, in terms of outcome, it is important to remember that beyond needing to look both backward and forward, there is really no template for a possible outcome. So the states parties really can be creative and innovative. So we hope that they will be able to innovate and capture common grounds. For us, from the UN's point of view, it is very important to have a balance across all 3 pillars of the treaty. And if I could suggest, 5 or 6 issues that can be included in a successful outcome, however they might be captured in terms of a format. Number one, we would very much like to have a high-level reaffirmation of commitment to the treaty and to all obligations undertaken as a party to it. Number two, return to the logic, if you will, of President Reagan and General Secretary Gorbachev. A nuclear war cannot be won and must not be fought. Obviously, you don't have to say it exactly like that, but to capture the logic and the spirit of it, it will be quite important. And then three, we think that a package of risk reduction measures that can help take the world away from a prospect of nuclear weapon use and towards nuclear disarmament is possible, not only important, but it is a possible element. I see that a lot of discussions are also taking place on this issue. And then the fourth, endorsement of the additional protocol as the NPT safeguards standards. I think it's also quite important. And then finally, this should not be just looking at the current and the previous situations, but consideration into the future in terms of mechanisms for the implementation of treaties goals, including new approaches to verification. I think there are a lot of things that we can look into. and it will also be very important into the future.
Thank you very much. Ms. Rustin, despite, as was mentioned, Monday's meeting in Vienna between the United States and Russia, the two countries still have not decided about what to do about the future of the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, also known as New START. That treaty will expire on February 5th, 2021, if it is not extended. So I'm wondering about your thoughts of what happens if this treaty does expire.
Well, we don't want that treaty to expire. If that treaty is let to expire, that would mean that there is no restraints for nuclear arms race, and that would be indeed a very dangerous situation.
So Izumi, if I could come in on that, please. Thank you, Alex. It's good to see both of you. Yeah, I mean, it's really critical that the New START treaty be extended both for US national security and indeed global security. And let me just step back a second and say that we're at a really dangerous time where the entire arms control and nonproliferation architecture that has kept us safe is eroding, with many treaties either going out of force, being dismantled, not being followed through. And New START is really, well, of course, the NPT is an incredibly important pillar. And in terms of the kind of Euro-Atlantic security architecture, the New START treaty is the last treaty remaining in place that regulates nuclear weapons between the United States and Russia, who have by far the largest nuclear arsenals in the world. I mean, more than 90% of the world's stockpiles. And as the High Representative said, maintaining the commitment to limit and reduce those weapons is essential to the nuclear nonproliferation treaty regime. And one of the stressors on that regime is a feeling on the part of the non-nuclear weapon states that the weapon states aren't holding up their end of the bargain to continue reducing weapons. But not more importantly, but kind of an additional point is how important this treaty is for our national security. Without New START, if it's allowed to expire in February, it will be the first time really in 45 years that we didn't have limits and verification on Russia's nuclear weapons and vice versa. Now, we've had brief periods in the past where there was a little bit of a gap as we were negotiating a new treaty. That was true in the very beginning of the Obama administration when the first START treaty was expiring, but negotiations were quickly underway to replace it. I think if New START were allowed to go out of force, it would be a long time before we could reach agreement on a new treaty to limit nuclear weapons with Russia. And so it would be kind of an unforced error to allow that treaty to go out of force when there's no realistic prospect of negotiating either a replacement with Russia or some kind of a new arrangement with China as well, which is being talked about, but is frankly, premature and not realistic at the moment. And we will end up with nothing, no restraints, no verification, no limits. And that is not a good place to be.
Alex, if I might just make a brief observation, since this is such an important topic, I agree completely with High Representative Nakamitsu and with Lynn Rustin on the importance of these treaty structures and especially New START. But one of the things that we have to keep in mind, and this is going to be and was always going to be a major issue at the NPT review conference, is the fact that within the structure of these treaties, over the past decade, we have seen a massive commitment to nuclear modernization by the United States, by Russia, and by the other countries with nuclear weapons. So despite the fact that we had a necessary limit on the number of nuclear weapons that the United States and Russia held, and as Lynn rightly says, that's 90% of all the nuclear weapons in the world, under that umbrella, there was no restriction on what they could do. And what we've seen is multi-trillion-dollar commitments to extending and investing in a new generation of nuclear weapons. We've seen the Russians parading all kinds of new weapon systems. The United States also developing and deploying new weapons. And so we see this kind of bifurcation between a limit on the number of nuclear weapons, which we thought would cap the arms race. And yet we see the arms race finding new means to continue and persist. And then from the point of view of non-weapon states and the international community as a whole, we need mechanisms to address both of these things. We need both treaty structures to cap and reduce the number of weapons, but also to find means of cooperatively agreeing how to restrain this possibility that we may have nuclear weapons for another 100 years if these new investments that are being made are allowed to continue.
So then, as Zia brought up, there are these new weapon systems that were debuted by the Russians a couple years back, and it's caused some concern. But there's now indications that at least 2 of those systems might actually fit under New START. How would that work?
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, President Putin talked about 5 or 6 new weapon systems. 2 of them, in terms of the ones that are strategic range, and that's the range that the New START treaty addresses, the 2 that actually have any real prospect of being deployed in the lifetime of an extended New START treaty, which is 5 years. The Russians have already said that they would be counted under the treaty. And in fact, they've already exhibited to US inspectors the something called the avant-garde hypersonic vehicle, which would sit on top of an ICBM. And so without New START, we never would have gotten to inspect that. And similarly, they're building a new, well, as Zia said, in terms of the modernization programs, but they're building a new intercontinental ballistic missile called the Sarmat, and they've made clear that that would count. And so, to the extent that the administration is trying to seek, is delaying a decision on New START to get leverage, I would say, the leverage has already worked, because to me, this was one of the most legitimate concerns or issues that needed to be resolved in the context of extending the treaty. And we now have solid Russian commitments and statements and an actual exhibit of a weapon to say that they will count. They have some other things under development that are less likely to actually come to fruition during the period over the next 5 years. If they were to, there is a vehicle through the treaty to raise concerns about those systems. And again, I mean, the choice is a treaty that limits what's limited now, plus these new systems that I mentioned, or nothing. It's not, New START versus some fancy super duper treaty that's going to limit every single weapon under the sun and China to boot. I mean, that is not the real world choice. So it's important to keep New START's limits and verification in place, and simultaneously pursue those agreements. The agreements that I mean, Zia in a way is referring. I mean, I think we need to get back to arms control that tries to encourage each side to more stabilizing force structures, that discourages countries from investing, more in systems that are usable, that are dangerous, and get back to reducing the role of nuclear weapons in our national security policy and in that of other countries.
Great. I'll definitely want to circle back around to the US-Russia thing, because it's such a core issue that we're going to be dealing with in the coming months and years. But there's 2 other big ticket items in the nuclear space that people tend to focus on a lot, and that's Iran and North Korea. So Zia, the Trump administration has taken very different approaches to dealing with these 2 different proliferation threats. Do you see a problem with having a very different approach to each particular challenge? And given that both diplomatic processes seem to be having some trouble, what steps do you recommend that the Trump administration and potential future U.S. administrations should take?
Thanks, Alex. That's an interesting question. One thing worth keeping in mind is that what we see now with regard to U.S. diplomacy on North Korea under the Trump administration of high-profile visits and handshakes and what President Trump called a love letter, and and some degree of restraint from the point of view of North Korea in terms of stopping, at least for now, the further testing of nuclear weapons and long-range missile systems that could carry nuclear weapons. And on the other hand, we have the US withdrawal from the nuclear deal with Iran, is that if you dial the clock back a few years, then what we see is that US diplomacy towards North Korea was actually very similar to what we now see with Iran, in that the US tried to prevent North Korea from moving towards having nuclear weapons. There was early agreements under the Clinton administration, for example, that would have capped and limited and prevented nuclear weapons development and deployment in North Korea. I mean, people have forgotten that a deal that would have prevented the kind of terrible situation we see on the Korean Peninsula and in the region now was on the table until the Bush administration came along and said, we're not going to talk to the North Koreans, and ended the agreement that had been put in place. And so North Korea responded to that by moving forward in its nuclear weapons program. And one fear many people have is that with the undoing of the nuclear deal with Iran, the US is going to replay that history that it had with North Korea, now with Iran. But the larger question is of how the US shapes its non-proliferation perspective with regard to different countries. And this has always been the case. This is not new to North Korea or Iran. You have to remember that the US was perfectly happy to see Britain and France get nuclear weapons. And yet it saw the Soviet Union and China getting nuclear weapons as a profound threat, and at one stage even contemplated attacking those programs preemptively. India getting nuclear weapons was not seen as a great crisis. Pakistan getting nuclear weapons was seen as a problem. Israel's nuclear weapons, the United States prefers not to even talk about most of the time. And so the idea that there is actually a consistent non-proliferation perspective that one would expect from international law or international norms that countries shouldn't have nuclear weapons is actually absent from most of the history of US nuclear non-proliferation policy. Everything is seen through, are they potentially our friends or are they potentially our enemies? And how are we going to deal with this situation now? And that may change going forward in the future with different countries as relationships evolve. And so what we see at any given time and the contradictions, et cetera, is pretty characteristic of US nuclear non-proliferation policy.
Can I just jump in for a minute? Because I do want to say that some of what Zia has said is quite historical in terms of his references to France and the UK. I mean, that goes back to what the 50s and maybe early 60s. And my point being that I think the United States as a country historically over time, especially since signing the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, has a very clear view that we do not want to see any more countries acquiring nuclear weapons, and we're seeking to, reverse the proliferation that has occurred. So I just think that's now. I don't think that the current administration has carried out that agenda very competently. I think it was reckless to withdraw from the JCPOA. I think the diplomacy toward North Korea has been not serious. But I do think I don't want to leave the audience with the impression, at least from my perspective, that the United States is cavalier about the potential for new nuclear weapon states. I think that's a firm, policy of the United States, and something that we've, actually had really good cooperation historically with, including with China, with Russia on things like the JCPOA, and hopefully again in the future in addressing North Korea. So.
Thanks,
Let
Lynn.
me just follow up with Lynn's point.
Okay,
there.
just very quickly, those.
Very quickly. I mean, I didn't mean to presume or to suggest that US policy is cavalier. It's not arbitrary, it's not whimsical. It is actually informed by a judgment by one administration after the next, which does change on what is in the US national interest. And so literally in 30 seconds, with the case of the United States and Pakistan, right? When Pakistan tested nuclear weapons in 1998, and India tested, there was a UN Security Council resolution which said they should stop their nuclear weapons programs, right? And the US imposed sanctions, quite rightly, on both countries for having tested nuclear weapons. And yet, after 9/11, all US sanctions on Pakistan were lifted. The US gave billions of dollars in aid to Pakistan. There was, in fact, no significant effort to do anything about Pakistan's nuclear weapons program because the war against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda was seen as more pressing. And one can understand the logic of this. So it's not cavalier, it's a judgment of national interests. And all I'm saying is that the presumption that non-proliferation is the prominent or sole or consistent driver is not borne out by the historical record.
Thanks, Zia. We'll be able to get into the South Asia issue a little bit more in a second here. But first, to High Representative Nakamitsu, a common refrain that I've been hearing both here in the United States and abroad, back when I could travel abroad, was the idea that arms control is dead, that we've seen so many treaties collapse, that they haven't been working properly, and then further, that the old kind of bilateral arms control treaties, like the ones we've seen between the Russians and the United States, don't really work anymore, aren't usable in a 21st century context. So what are your thoughts on those sort of pronouncements? And then what do you think that arms control will look like or should look like in the future?
Very important question. Thank you. Well, let's start with this. Let's try to make sure that arms control is not dead. We don't want arms control to be dead, and we have to absolutely make sure that that will survive. I think everyone will agree that it is being eroded in front of our eyes. One of the reasons why it's a bilateral treaty. It's not usually for the United Nations to actually talk about New START, but because it is so important to be extended, we are consistently calling for the extension of it. Now, this said, the world is indeed a very different place from, for example, when the New START treaty was negotiated. One of the reasons why we feel so strongly about the extension of a New START is also to buy time, if you will, so that we can, number one, come to a common understanding of how the world is so completely different, and therefore, what might be new approaches or new vision for arms control and disarmament. This would take some time. It's not an easy task, easy work to do. So we will need some time to figure these things out. Now, in terms of a different landscape, I think you will all agree, and it has already come out in this conversation today, the global nuclear order is now really more multipolar and also regional, as Zia and Lynn both pointed out. There are multiple nuclear dyads and even triads, and as well as really increased proliferation risks in some of the regions with both old and new conflict. So we're really looking at a very dangerous, risky world. And another very important development, it hasn't come up today yet, but those developments related to technological evolution, developments, very rapid, have changed the way we think about strategic weapons and also strategic stability. And also, I would argue very strongly, introducing dangerous new risks as well. And we can really look at what is going on in the cyber AI discussions, but also outer space, some of the missile technologies, et cetera, et cetera. And all these things are actually happening also against the background of a really sort of exacerbated and complex mixture of geopolitical tensions amongst the great powers. So it's a really different place where we used to know it. So this probably means, and we have actually started to say this, we are reaching a point where we need to take a fresh and comprehensive look at our approaches to elimination of nuclear weapons, maintaining prohibitions on other weapons of destruction, and also regulating the use of conventional weapons and ensuring that new technologies are used in accordance with international laws and norms. and also our conscience, to be blunt. Now, especially in relation to nuclear weapons, I think any new thinking should not undermine the historic gains over made over the past 50 years or so. I think we have indeed made an enormous gains, and we cannot revert to the dangerous and really destabilizing days of unconstrained nuclear competition. Let's make sure of that. This said, new approaches. First thing I would say is that any new approach or new vision, I would argue, should be really based on two core principles. One principle is, of course, you can imagine coming from the United Nations, we would like to maintain and strengthen the total elimination of nuclear weapons and the preservation of a norm against the use of nuclear weapons as a shared objective, top priority, and it is indeed a top priority for our UN's disarmament. The second core principle, I think, is things like verifiability, irreversibility, transparency, accountability, and of course enforcement. Those really have to underpin any new vision going forward. So those two areas of core principles, we hope and we argue, should be maintained, and I would even say further strengthened. Now, looking into the future, there are many different factors, many different issues that we need to make sure will be analyzed, discussed, etc. And let me just, suggest non-exhaustive 6 or 7 issues that we think will be quite important to reflect on. Number one, that has to encompass all kinds of nuclear weapons. Their delivery systems, very important. And as Zia also pointed out, also Lynn, qualitative developments really needs to be looked at. Disarmament has been so far numbers, but we think it is now important to look at the qualities as well. Number two, as many have mentioned already, we need to find a way to go beyond the bilateral context and include other nuclear weapon states or nuclear armed states, possessor states. And number three, and I'm really keen to listen to both of you, Zia and Lynn, strengthen regional approaches for disarmament, including through development of confidence building measures, because the nuclear crisis actually are demonstrated in different regions in a slightly different way. So we need to have a little bit more tailored approach at the regional level. The fourth might be to enhance transparency about new weapon systems and seek to restrict or even prohibit those deemed really destabilizing. I think that's really important. The fifth, to address the issue of anti-missile systems, and I know this is a very sensitive issue, but especially ballistic missile defense systems. That's also related to the issues that we are talking about. The sixth, also to address the long overdue regulation of missiles. Missiles, probably most difficult, most sensitive issue. We don't have a global standard, global norm, but this is the primary delivery vehicle for nuclear weapons. And they are, as we see it, really undermining regional security. And for us, the UN also very important civilian protections dimensions as well. The seventh could be to seek to address the concurrent promise and challenges of new technology. And new technologies are very diverse, but for us already getting into cybersecurity and AI and how these will affect nuclear risks, not in terms of command and control systems, etc. I think that's a key issue that goes to the heart of a strategic stability concept. And then finally, strengthen verification and compliance mechanisms. And I think those measures, if we are able to strengthen those, then that will also benefit in terms of changing the trust landscape. States can still be confident in the instruments, that they agree. And I would say the new technologies will be able to help us in this regard. We often talk about, the dark side of technology, but not sufficiently how we might be able to use also technology in verification that would, reinforce the implementation aspect of it. Now, my final word, we will be, UN will be very happy to be a platform for states and experts and other stakeholders to come and have a dialogue. One thing that we still do have is a little bit of a trust as a convening power, impartial, and if we could also offer a little bit of expertise and thinking capacity that we could exercise together with many of our partners in academic world, expert community, then I think we will be able to make a contribution, and we're very keen to do that.
Fantastic. So Lynn, the High Representative has really drawn out the places we need to go, the things we need to do. But we really are operating from a trust deficit between multiple Russian treaty violations and multiple US treaty withdrawals. How do these two countries, that have 90% of the world's nuclear weapons, build new legal frameworks that are going to last? And then how can other countries actually trust these two particular countries that have had these trust issues in the creation of multilateral agreements?
Well, it is definitely a challenging environment, but I think it comes from a, first from a place of political will and mutual interest. And so it requires, agreements, arms control is a tool, right, of national security. It's not an end in itself. And so agreements are successful when both parties see a mutual interest and see an interest in accepting some restraints on itself because of the benefit it gets from constraining the other party. And I do think when it comes to nuclear weapons, there really isn't any such thing as unilateral advantage. And there's a reason why for 50 years we've been engaged in an arms limitation and reduction process. And so I do think that I hope there's not a gap. I hope New START is kept in place. But I think even if it expires at some point, our countries will get back to some form of limitations, and probably legally binding limitations, and hopefully reductions. I do think it's true also that the advances of technology, as the High Representative mentioned, and weaponry are putting us in a world where the future, now I'm not in the camp that says there's no role for legally binding agreements. I think there still is. But I also think that some of the risks and threats that we have to manage don't lend themselves to those kinds of agreements. And so, for instance, something like cyber risks to nuclear command and control systems. There's nothing to count. And there's nothing to really verify, but you can have conversations about mutual self-interest. We don't, it's really not good if the Russians react to a false warning by lobbing a missile at us and vice versa. And so there has to be some recognition of, of mutual interest and establishment of norms. Similarly, there can be, transparency and self-restraint in terms of things a country won't do because they recognize that it, prompts another country to take steps that are negative for our national security. And I think that missile defense, offense, defense relationship, is exactly that kind of thing, where it's been a third rail in our political system to even talk about restraints. But the fact is, a lot of the things that Russia is doing in terms of its weapon systems that we're now concerned about were prompted by their probably exaggerated fears of our missile defense. So, and that's also a dynamic in the regional situation in North Asia. And so there's a lot to do and address, and it's not going to be done on the basis of trust so much as mutual self-interest. And but I think, well, Senator Nunn likes to say where I work, we're in a race between catastrophe and cooperation. And so I think we have to push on the cooperation side.
Great.
Lynn, Alex, just one quick comment on this, because I think that Lynn is absolutely right about cooperation and mutual interest. And one of the things that I think is worth highlighting, especially for a US audience, is that the space between the countries that have decided never to make nuclear weapons and the countries that rely on nuclear weapons for their military defense has probably not been as large as it is now for many generations. And that's been evident with the fact that 122 non-nuclear weapon states agreed on a treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons at the United Nations in 2017. And they've been signing and ratifying it until it's expected to come into force perhaps later this year or early next year. And so they've been very clear about what they see as the future for nuclear weapons, and that is a nuclear weapon-free world. And they've charted out what they imagine that should and could look like. But the fact is that they've chosen not to make them, and that they've chosen to go beyond a nuclear non-proliferation treaty to a treaty for the prohibition of all nuclear weapons, including the threat of nuclear weapons. In other words, it's a treaty that would forbid reliance on nuclear deterrence as a national security policy. All 9 of the countries with nuclear weapon states have refused to participate even in the negotiation of this treaty. You don't have to join, but you could at least turn up for the talks. And they actually actively tried to prevent, in some cases, the negotiations. And so the gap between the imagination of the nuclear future of the nuclear weapon states with their commitments to modernization that will take decades to realize, and then the decades those weapon systems will last. And on the other hand, the non-weapon states who are already committing themselves now to a nuclear weapon-free world is a huge gap, and finding a way to find common cause and common purpose and mutual interest between these 9 countries with nuclear weapon states and the overwhelming majority of the world's countries who think there is no future for nuclear weapons in the world is a major task that we're going to face.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think we could have a whole session about the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, but always important to remind folks that the majority of the world's population actually still lives in nuclear weapon states or states covered by a nuclear, extended deterrent umbrella. So it's really more even than it appears if you're just doing numerical counts of states. But speaking of an issue that we could also spend an entire session on, Zia, I was hoping you could talk a little bit about something we don't focus as much on, and that's nuclear tensions in South Asia and the challenge it presents to global security. And just wanted to get a little bit of your thoughts about how India and Pakistan move to a process where they can start talking in a formal dialogue about nuclear risk reduction. And then given recent tensions between India and China that we've all been watching in the news, is there room for a trilateral dialogue on nuclear tensions in the region?
Well, thanks, Alex. The South Asia situation is a source of grave concern for many people, especially the people in the region. But you have to remember that in the case of India and Pakistan, what we would now call their nuclear contest really became a dynamic in their relationship after the nuclear tests in 1998. I mean, India had tested first in 1974, which led Pakistan to start its nuclear weapons program. But what we've seen is they've gone from a handful of nuclear weapons in 1998, 99 to perhaps 150 or so each now, and a variety of nuclear missiles, and no significant arms control or restraint measure agreed between them. So in 20 years, they've built up their nuclear weapons, made large investments in nuclear weapons production complexes, and have failed to agree on any kind of significant restraint. It's exactly what the US and the Soviets did for the first 20 years of their nuclear arms race. Build-ups, nobody knew when to say enough. Nobody was willing to take the political risk to say the person, the other side that we've demonized for so long and used as the justification for our nuclear build-up, we can now talk to them about how to stop this. And, it took the Cuban Missile Crisis, enlightened leadership, both on the part of the United States and the Soviet Union and the international community, to press both of them to say, look, we live in the world too. And if you go to war, we're all going to be badly affected by this. So you have to do something. So far, that has been missing in India and in Pakistan, and sadly, on the part of the international community. Peace movements and people who would drive the debate towards restraint and arms control, and hopefully eventually disarmament, have been overwhelmed by forces of nationalism and the equivalent of Cold War paranoia. And the international community has had other concerns rather than pressing both of them to say, look, if India and Pakistan go to war, we now know from modern studies of nuclear winter that effects of burning cities following the use of nuclear weapons could cause catastrophic environmental damage affecting large sections of the world. So the whole world has an imperative to engage with them on this question. And yet the world is distracted with all the other problems that it has right now. And so neither from within nor from without is there really an imperative driving either country towards restraint. And we now see over and over again nuclear crises. The two countries shoot at each other on a regular, almost daily basis along the line of control in Kashmir. And this is a dispute that's led to 3 wars between them in the past already. And so it's a situation where, you know, we can see that domestically it's hard to imagine anything being able to break that nationalism and Cold War paranoia and the control of the military-industrial complex on both sides that is increasingly affecting policy. So the world is going to have to kind of intervene much more substantially to say, look, you know, we actually do worry about what you're doing, and we're going to press you to restrain and see what they can do. And so I think really any kind of confidence building or measure of restraint is going to have to come from the world showing up in Delhi and Islamabad and saying, look, enough already.
Great. Thanks, Zia. We have one question already. If people have other questions, feel free to send them into the chat. The first one is, how can intermediate range issues, I assume intermediate range missile issues, be addressed if China isn't willing to participate in a dialogue about them? Now, Lynn, you worked on the INF Treaty quite a bit at the State Department, and we're looking at ways to get past the compliance issues we were dealing with. Is there ever a way to bring China in on an intermediate range reduction conversation?
Well, that's a good question. You know, so we're now in an environment whereas there have been a global ban on intermediate and shorter range missiles with Russia. The treaty that brought about that ban is now gone following Russia's violation and US withdrawal. So we're now at a situation where that's completely unregulated. And how we do, I don't know. I think it would be really challenging to deal with it on a trilateral basis. I think, first of all, with Russia, we can look at an agreement that covers strategic and intermediate range delivery vehicles with some, you know, freedom to mix in between might be a way to handle that, as well as maybe some agreement on not deploying in the European region, but then that would require Russia to move missiles that it has there now, and that it probably we won't agree on what the range is, but we might be able to agree on where they are. In terms of China, my sense is that the United States has a lot more deep thinking to do about what it is we're actually trying to achieve, what we want China to do in terms of its dual capable and nuclear forces, which are, you know, 10 times smaller than ours. We forget that. And also what we're prepared to give. What are China's security concerns in the Asia Pacific? And what is, you know, what is the area of overlap? And I think you really have to walk before you run. And that's where you get back to the points that the High Representative was making in terms of a regional dialogue, which really starts with, you know, confidence building and risk reduction before you jump to some kind of a nuclear arms control agreement or an arms agreement, you know, addressing delivery systems. And it will end up being an asymmetric conversation because we have, because of geography, we have different forces in the region, and we have them for different reasons, including the concerns we have about North Korea and protection of our allies. So it's complicated, and I think we have to kind of start at the beginning. And I don't have the sense that we've actually done the serious homework in terms of what we're trying to achieve, which is a lot different than showing up in a room with some flags and complaining that the other party didn't show up.
Zia or High Representative Nakamitsu, any thoughts on the intermediate range issue, or more generally about how China is enticed into broader arms control agreement discussions?
Well, I think, if I may, if we're going to think about a global ban, then you have to remember that the missile systems that are being developed by India and Pakistan would also fall under a truly global ban. And so I think one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is that, are we seeking restrictions that suit US national interests with regard to Russia because of Europe, and with regard to China because of US and allied interests in East Asia? Or are we thinking about a global ban on particular range systems of nuclear and conventional missiles? Right? And so otherwise one has a situation where, okay, suppose the Chinese were to join, right? That still leaves the Indians, the Pakistanis, and the Israelis, and the Iranians and others with intermediate range missiles. And so does that mean that it's okay for them, but not for others to have those kinds of missiles? And so there's a larger set of issues that one actually has to grapple with. Is the driving logic that is at work settling particular regional issues one at a time? Or is it actually getting to the core of the matter, which is the structure of military alliances outside the United Nations system, where Japan or South Korea feels they have to rely on Taiwan, feels they have to rely on the United States to defend them because they believe nobody else will come to their defense? Or is it that, and which is why the US is there, and which is why the Chinese have all of these missiles pointed, not because they couldn't overwhelm Japan and South Korea, but because they would imagine being in a war with the United States. And so the underlying structures that we actually have to deal with are much more profound. They have to deal with the need some countries feel they need military alliances because of the inadequacies of the international community as a community to commit to the defense of all of its members fairly and properly. And so we need to have that conversation as well as these regional conversations. And so I agree completely with Lynn that we need those, but underlying it all is the question of how do we ensure that the community and all its members feel that everybody will come to their defense if they are actually threatened.
High Representative, thoughts on the issue?
Well, I think Zia so eloquently, described the complexity of it all. I think, nuclear disarmament is, of course, for us, it's a really important moral imperative, but it has to be done in such a way that everyone's security interest, legitimate security interest, needs to be properly understood. I think that's a starting point. It cannot be just one country or few countries in the region, but how these are interlinked, and how those concerns are not properly understood by relevant actors, I think is feeding into the lack of trust environment. So that's why we need to have a safe place, and it's not just one place, but we need to deepen those conversations and laying out options. And I would say that it has to be, it cannot be just one measure that will bring us to a safer world. It has to be a package of very different instruments, multilateral, legally binding agreements, but reciprocal, political, actions, negotiated political agreements, even unilateral actions that are, sort of coordinated. So, the future of arms control and disarmament will have to have very different sets of measures, code of conduct, soft norms, etc. All these things need to be looked at and packaged in such a way that will, best address the security interest of as many countries as possible. And that's why it is hugely complicated. It will require, I wanted to talk about leadership. What we don't have at the moment that we see in almost any issues, not just on this arms control, but we need political leadership at the multilateral level on many of the critical agenda that confront us. And without that political leadership, it will be very, very difficult to move forward. But it's going to be very important.
Great. We're wrapping up again. If there are any questions, please send them to the chat. We obviously have a lot of challenges in front of us, as we've all outlined. Are you concerned about the potential lack of lawyers, diplomats, experts focused on arms control and nonproliferation? Do we have enough people to do the work that we need in front of us? And if your answer is no, how would you encourage people to join the field? So we'll start with Lynn.
Okay. Well, first of all, let me give a shout out to two overly maligned groups, which would be civil servants in our government and lawyers, because I have to say, in my many years of experience in government, some of the most capable people that I had the pleasure of working with were the lawyers in the state legal department who helped us write the language as we were negotiating treaties. And that expertise is there. I think this really goes back to leadership and priorities, because when something is a priority for an administration, such as arms control, disarmament, diplomacy, then they assign the resources and the bureaucratic structures to support that. And they attract the good people to work on it. And when those issue areas are deprioritized, then the structures are changed so that you don't have the focus, and a lot of good people who work in those areas find other things to work on in or out of government. So I think it all comes down to priority and focus, and diplomacy and tools like arms control are sorely needed and under-resourced at the moment.
Zia?
Well, I'd like to add to your list scientists and engineers. We don't need just diplomats. It is actually, these are the people that design nuclear weapons, make them, maintain them, modernize them. And it is partly our problem that we have given over to the world. And I think it is absolutely necessary to have a new generation of young scientists and engineers around the world engage with these questions. I mean, you have to remember, there are 9 countries with nuclear weapons, and the United States by itself has 3 nuclear weapon laboratories with budgets of more than $2 billion each. And people go to work every day to make and design and think about nuclear weapon science. We don't have one laboratory in the world that does disarmament science that is anywhere comparable. I mean, we have a few academic programs and a few policy people in think tanks, etc. But even if there was to be one global nuclear disarmament laboratory, right? We can have a particle accelerator in Switzerland that studies the fundamental structure of the universe, but there is not a single global nuclear disarmament laboratory where scientists and engineers from Africa, Latin America, East Asia, countries without nuclear weapons can develop the science that we need to get to nuclear disarmament.
I absolutely nominate you, Zia, to run that lab.
Can I just, I support the idea, but can I also just for perspective say that at our national labs, we have scientists who work hard to make sure that we keep the stockpile that we have now safe and secure without nuclear testing, which is critical. We have people hard at work on verification challenges and disarmament challenges and important technological developments that help us do things like, think about how we're going to dismantle nuclear weapons through an arms control agreement safely without revealing sensitive information. So I just want to say that our national labs and the expertise there are doing some really solid work in this area, which doesn't mean we shouldn't have a dedicated lab for these issues.
High Representative Nakamitsu, will let you have the final thought about getting more lawyers, diplomats, engineers, scientists into the field.
Well, no, I mean, in addition to what had been already mentioned by Lynn and Zia, I would also emphasize the importance of new generation, younger generation. We need to make sure that younger people, will have a say, and those younger people will be properly equipped with the expertise and the skills that are required. We try to do, with the small resources that we have at the United Nations, we are definitely prioritizing education and youth outreach activities because it is indeed important. And I think it's very important to have more innovative approaches also. And those innovative approaches will most likely come from younger people, scientists, engineers, and diplomats and lawyers.
Great. I unfortunately, we're just about out of time. We have a couple questions that came in late about doing future constraints on testing and deployment of delivery systems, a question about the military industrial complex and its effect on all of these issues that we've been talking about. So what I'd like to do is encourage everyone who's been listening, and we so appreciate those who've joined us, Lynn's organization, the Nuclear Threat Initiative, Princeton University, my organization, the Center for Arms Control, and of course the UN Office of Disarmament Affairs have panels and writings, beyond anything you could possibly imagine. They're always available, oriented towards the public, and we would very much encourage you all to join. But I'd really like to thank all of our speakers. I think it was a really fascinating discussion, and very much thanks to the American Society of International Law for hosting this very interesting conference. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.